Today, if you're in the foyer, please come on in and grab a seat. We are going to get started. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I am Paul Matthews. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. And I want to thank everyone you see up front. I also want to thank the audience and those of you watching later on streaming. This is a really important issue of our urban school facility needs. And we are very proud at the Worcester Regional Research Bureau to have had the opportunity to work with Ben Foreman and MassInc on this issue. The Bureau is a 40-year-old nonprofit in Worcester, which is New England's second largest city, which I'm sure everyone knows in the audience. We conduct objective, data-based research on some of the most pressing public policy issues facing central Massachusetts. One such report was Building the Future. We looked at the facility needs of the Worcester Public Schools and our 25,000 students and the importance of state support for school facility construction and renovation. So we were honored to be asked to contribute to this conversation by MassInc, and I'm very proud to be kicking this off. So on that note, I need to turn it over to State Representative Rob Consalvo from the 14th Suffolk District. Since 2021, he has represented the Boston neighborhoods of Hyde Park, Rosendale, Reedville, and West Roxbury. He's a former aide to Ted Kennedy. He's a former Boston City Councilor, former Deputy Director of Boston's Home Center. He, interestingly, was a senior advisor to the Superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. His committee assignments include Vice Chair of Rules and Joint Committee on Housing and Labor and Workforce Development. Most appropriately today, he's the proud father of 3 Boston Public School students, and he has a degree from Xavier University. So on that note, happy to turn it over to Representative Consalvo.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that introduction, and I'm really happy to be here this morning to welcome all of you on behalf of the House of Representatives to this event. I want to thank my friend Joe Kreisberg, Ben, and the team from MassInc for all the important work that you do every day. I'm particularly grateful to be here to offer welcoming remarks, not just as a state representative from Boston, or a 13-year member of the Boston City Council, or even as the former Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to the Superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. But as Paul pointed out, I'm really, most importantly, glad to be here as a Boston Public School parent of 3 children, as a champion of the Boston Public Schools, and as a friend to the Boston Teachers Union, who I work so closely with as my time as a city councilor, as well as now a state representative. And I know my great friend and former BTU president and my constituent Jessica Tang is somewhere here in the audience. There she is. So thank you, President, for your friendship. And let me first echo the words which, after reading the report that I found on page 11, which recognizes what a hugely important partner the MSBA is to the Commonwealth. And I have seen firsthand in my work as a city councilor, as well as working for the superintendent, firsthand the hard work, dedication, and commitment that the staff at the MSBA exhibits each day on every project. In the city of Boston, the MSBA has been an important part of the work to continue to make the Boston Public Schools even better. I commend then Mayor Marty Walsh and our current Mayor Michelle Wu for their strong efforts to leverage funding opportunities from the MSBA to modernize, improve, and enhance school buildings in the city of Boston. And the success and importance of these opportunities is evident in what's happening in our city. In Boston, there are currently 112 school buildings, of which approximately 2/3 were built before World War II. Since 2017, the city has leveraged over $180 million in core funds to build a new Dearborn STEM Academy, a new Boston Arts Academy, a new Josiah Quincy Upper School, and a new Carter School, an amazing school which serves students with significant cognitive disabilities and complex medical needs. And if you haven't seen the Carter or visited the Carter, it is an amazing, once-in-a-country school that's serving our most fragile students, and I would urge you all to take a visit to that incredible school in Boston. In addition, Boston has worked hard to improve existing buildings through the MSBA's Accelerated Repair Program. And in that same time frame, we've secured over $60 million for things like new windows, new roofs, and updated energy-efficient boiler systems. That work has improved building condition and modernized schools across the district. Improvements such as these are critically important for creating environments where children can learn, they can excel, And these enhancements will ensure that every Boston Public School student is ready for college, career, and life. These investments can and do make a difference, and they have made a difference for thousands of Boston Public School students from all over the city of Boston, including the Consalvo children. In the future, cities and towns should work and must continue to work and engage with the MSBA to replace aging structures to ensure that all school buildings in the Commonwealth can be modern places for learning well into the 21st century. What's next for the city of Boston? I am thrilled that Mayor Wu has announced that she intends to rebuild or substantially renovate the Madison Park Technical Vocational High School campus in Roxbury, and that she intends to aggressively seek MSBA funding to do so. This is a historic opportunity in the city of Boston to give our students a state-of-the-art technical vocational high school that's right in the heart of our city. The time is now for this to happen and for this dream to become a reality, and I look forward to being a part of working with all of you, as well as my colleagues on the City Council and the Boston School Committee, to make that happen. As we continue to go forward, I also look forward to working with everyone on this panel, for all the folks in this room, and for all of my colleagues in the legislature, to make sure that the Massachusetts continues to lead the nation in education, including being a state, a nation-leading state, that has the best facilities where children can learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative. And I do realize he has another hearing to attend, so he's going to exit when he has to, and I want everyone to know it's not what's said on stage.
Yes, thank you. My committee has a 10 o'clock hearing that's running simultaneously, so I'll be sneaking off to that. But I again thank Mass Inc. for being here today for the report. I enjoyed reading it, and I want to thank all the panelists and all the folks, all the great work you do in your cities and towns, your municipalities, on behalf of children and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And on this point, I'm happy and proud to turn it over both to my colleague, Anthony Clough, who's a research associate with the Worcester Bureau and authored our previous report on Worcester's school facility needs, and my friend and colleague, Ben Foreman, from the Gateway City Center at Mass Inc. So take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. So Ben and I will be presenting the key findings from Fixing the Foundation, Uneven Access to Modern Schools, and a Blueprint for a More Equitable Future. We were working on this project for almost a year, maybe a little more, and we got some great data from the MSBA. They worked with us and helped us understand the data from a lot of different vantage points. Without them and their access to that data, this project would not have been possible. So we're going to walk through our key findings. But first, I just wanted to explain a little bit about the MSBA. It's a quasi-independent authority. Their debts are not debts of the Commonwealth, and their job is to reimburse communities across the Commonwealth, walk them through the project from when the budget is decided to when it's done and constructed. We looked at the core program, and the core program at the MSBA is for large-scale new construction projects and significant renovations, as the accelerated repair program focuses on boilers and smaller renovations. So our analysis here is solely on that aspect of the authority. So our first question here was, what types of districts are more likely to receive those invitations? And we focused on data from 2015 to 2024. So when districts apply to work with the MSBA, they send statements of interest, SOIs. And from the time that the survey was underway until when data was available, we looked at districts in cities, in rural communities, in suburban districts, and career vocational and technical schools. And whether those are located in gateway cities or Boston or not, those are included in that separate category. So as you can see here on the y-axis, 1 marks proportional representation, and as you can see, Boston and gateway cities were the least likely to receive projects over this time period, and so too were rural communities. But suburban communities were overrepresented, as were vocational and technical schools, but they made up about, at the time of the 2016 MSBA survey, about 30 schools, and they received 12 invitations. So suburban districts obviously make up a much larger share, about 45% of schools, but they received 54% of invitations over this time period. So we're seeing, just based on the invitation outcomes, who's being invited to do these significant rebuilds or these significant renovation projects. We're seeing suburban districts benefiting more than our urban and city schools. And this is sort of confounding because when we looked through the MSBA data, we found that Boston and Gateway City schools were vastly overrepresented in schools that need significant attention. So if you look at the first two columns, schools with a low general environment rating and low building condition rating, those are two different metrics that the MSBA used in their 2016 survey to differentiate schools across the Commonwealth when they go out and survey the facilities. General environment rating is a broader measure. It's made up of 6 different broad metrics: learning environment, safety, accessibility, academic sufficiency, program sufficiency, and the institution's technological capabilities. An example of a learning environment indicator might be, or was, the number of schools that have natural sunlight, classrooms with natural sunlight. Does the school have an open floor plan? Academic sufficiency was defined as the ratio of typical classrooms for students versus module classrooms. So is your school sort of busting at the seams and you need a lot of modular additions to have your students? Basically, general environment rating is, are these schools, to what degree are these schools beneficial for student learning and teaching? Lower building condition rating was strictly 25 site and building components, so things like HVAC, flooring, wall quality, more about the bare bones of the building rather than its overall ability to deliver an environment for adequate teaching and learning. So we see that Boston is 5 times more likely than schools that exist across the state to be with a low general environment rating, and they're also overrepresented by nearly 2 times their share of schools across the Commonwealth of buildings with poor condition. We also looked at schools that were missing major essential features. We looked at schools missing art classrooms, music classrooms, gymnasiums, cafeterias, and science labs. And we found that Boston schools were 2.5 times larger than their share of statewide schools to be in that group, and Gateway cities were about 1.5 times more likely. Finally, we looked at overcrowding, and this is, again, as of the 2016 MSBA survey, but we know that our city schools are still more overcrowded than suburban and rural districts that are more likely to have to be underutilized. So again, we see Boston and Gateway cities making a disproportionate share of those schools as well. So you might think that maybe these suburban districts, by building condition rating, are also overrepresented, but that's not necessarily true. And when we look at the invitations that have been extended over 2015 to 2024, we found that around 2/3 of assessed buildings were given to level 1 and level 2 buildings by building condition rating, and those are the best rated schools, while 11 out of 20 level 4 schools, the worst quality by building condition rating, were built over this time. We found that based on the 156 invitations extended over this time period, not only could the MSBA have finished all 20 of the level 4 schools, but they could have financed over half of the level 3 schools, the third worst building condition. Instead, they only did about 1/3 of those level 3 schools. So we're just trying to look here at what the building condition ratings are and where the invitation outcomes might have been skewed out of a needs-based, data-driven approach. Next, and this is probably one of my personal favorite findings, this was the most interesting data to work with. We looked at which types of, we already found that there's a disparity, disproportionate impact in cities like Boston, Gateway cities, but which types of students are these most likely to be? It's our Black, Hispanic, and low-income students. While English learners are not pictured here, this was also a big disparity. So when we're looking at schools that don't have access to music rooms, classrooms, we see across the board that it's our Hispanic students, our Black students, and low-income students that don't have access to schools with these key learning features. So for example, when we read this chart in the middle, Hispanic students, relative to their white peers across the state, are 3 times more likely to be in a school without a library. So when you read across the board here, you can see that these students are more likely to be in inadequate learning facilities based on what we looked at here. Next, we're going to talk about the general cost pressures and some of what's happening in the market with regards to MSBA projects. From 2009 to 2022, the last time when the MSBA's cost dashboard was updated with the most recent cost per square foot of school projects across the state, that average cost per square foot has increased 135% over that time period. And starting with $275 per square foot in 2009, if the costs increased by the producer price index for non-residential construction in the Northeast, or the PPI for school construction across the US, we see that MSBA projects are coming in at a much higher rate over this time period. So they're outstripping these economic indicators and inflation. We know that these projects in the area are very expensive, and we think that this is leading to a decline in interest in the MSBA. But this is latent demand. It's not that these districts don't want to be applying, it's that these financial conditions are making it more difficult and more willing. These communities are less willing to take on the debt to finance these projects. And that's pretty clear in our next slide. We can see that when the MSBA first started taking applications around 2009, there was a lot of interest, over 200 applications, and in the following years, similar trends. But after 2012, there was a precipitous decline, and since then a steady decline in the number of statements of interest that districts were sending. And we've seen that the number of core program invitations extended, the MSBA coming back and saying, yes, we'll take on your project, it's fluctuated, but it's remained relatively low and hasn't risen while construction costs have been increasing. So we're really trying to make the case that the MSBA needs more resources in order to reimburse these communities, take on more projects, and support our urban districts. Next, we're going to talk about the MSBA's cost control policies from 30,000 feet in the air. When we looked at the reimbursement rates in the statute, communities that are more disadvantaged, that are not as property value rich, have lower incomes per capita, and have a higher share of low-income students in the district, they're supposed to get a much higher reimbursement rate. At the lowest, a very advantaged community will get 31%. And that's not including any incentive points they might have for making green-friendly schools that are more energy efficient. You get a few incentive points for that, a few percentage points here and there, but mostly it's 31%, and the maximum for the most disadvantaged communities like Worcester, Springfield, Lowell, Lawrence, it's 80%. These are some of the cost eligibility criteria that the MSBA has created since the statute to control costs. So there's a cap on the square foot that they reimburse for. Their land acquisition is not an eligible cost. Site remediation is ineligible. Demolition, including lead and asbestos removal, is partially ineligible. Temporary location of students, that's sort of a hidden cost. That's what it costs the district to move students into a temporary location while the school is being rebuilt. And auxiliary or shared community spaces are also ineligible. So when districts want to add a library or a child care center or something that's not core to what is defined as the K through 12 educational experience, and a lot of city districts want to go forward with these projects, that's on their dime. The MSBA won't reimburse for that. So focusing mostly on the cost per square foot limits, we analyzed what the state statute says they should get back for reimbursement rate and what communities by type actually got back. And we saw significant gaps again in our city districts. So Boston, from 2008 to 2020, Boston's 4 MSBA projects, the gap between the state and the effective reimbursement rate was 34%. In gateway cities, the average was about 19%. In other cities, outside of the 26 gateway cities, it was about 17%. And we see that in rural and vocational districts, there are also gaps. No district gets exactly what the state statute says, but suburban districts had an effective gap of about 12%. So we see that there's something here in the MSBA's reimbursement policies that are disadvantaging our cities that are taking on the bonding just like any other community is, but they're not seeing the same financial benefits. They're being disproportionately hurt by the cost control policies that we analyzed.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. I'm going to take over from here. I'm Ben Foreman. I'm the director of the MassInc Policy Center. I think many of you know MassInc was founded 30 years ago really to focus on the state of the middle class and economic mobility and whether there were still ladders to the middle class in Massachusetts or it was in an economy that was really seeing more and more rising inequality. And a key component of this increase in inequality is geographic sorting of upper income households further away from middle and lower income households in very significant increases in school segregation. So we've been paying a lot of attention to that because we know school segregation is one of the leading drivers of achievement gaps and leads to uneven educational outcomes and means we're not developing our talent to the fullest. A few years ago, we did a report just looking at these trends, and one of the most striking things in it was we've seen quite a bit of integration at the neighborhood level in Massachusetts, in some of our cities, especially Boston, but we haven't seen that lead to any integration in the public schools. So, one important question for us is, how much does the state of the buildings in our urban areas contribute to that? And this is a deeply personal question for me. I'm going to share some case studies that are in the report, but I want to start with my own experience. This is the school that my children attended, which is right on the J.P. Roxbury border, Mendel Elementary School. It's a beautiful building from the outside, but when you look at what it's equipped to provide students, it's very limited. There are no art rooms, there's no music rooms, there's no gym, there's no green space outside of the school. It's certainly a school that's over capacity. 2 of the classrooms are 2 blocks away at the YMCA. Until a few years ago, there was no kitchen to provide fresh food. A private foundation donated a kitchen to the school. So now there's fresh food, but there's no cafeteria to eat it in. And, our students did have the chance to experience what it's like to attend an integrated school, but they certainly paid a price in terms of the environment of that school. It wasn't until my students reached high school that they've had a chance to attend school with a gym and other features, and only because we did kind of what was the unthinkable to us. We packed up and moved when my daughter didn't get a space in an exam school. So 9th grade, this is the school that she went to, just a half a mile away in Brookline. This was the building just for the freshman students. She'd never been to a school that had a gym before, and now she's at a school that has 3 pools. She'd never been to a school with an art room before, and now she's at a school that has a whole building dedicated to the arts. And I don't know, maybe it's just going to high school, but I've seen an amazing change in her. It happened almost immediately, how eager she was to get up in the morning and go to school and learn. So with that, I want to turn to the case studies that are actually in the report and speak more to the findings in the report. This is the Peck School in Holyoke. It was an $85 million project. It had a 68% reimbursement rate. So Holyoke's entitled to 80%, as Anthony mentioned, and it got 68%. So only 12 percentage points off the statutory reimbursement rate. And I think you saw in those data, gateway cities were around 20 percentage points lower overall, whereas Boston was much deeper at a 35% haircut. And so I think one of the questions this raises is, why are the gateway cities closer? And I think the clear answer, obvious answer, is they're cost engineering to be as close to what the state will reimburse because they can't afford to pull any more money out of their pockets. So while this is a 21st century building, I don't know that students are necessarily getting 21st century education within it. It's a school that serves over 1,000 students. And here's the gym while it was under construction. If you looked at it today, this is a gym, but it's also a cafeteria and auditorium. It's a multi-purpose room where over 1,000 students are supposed to get their food, their meals, their physical education, and whatever arts theater they can provide in the auditorium all in one space, because that's what Holyoke can afford, and that's what we're providing the students of Holyoke today under the best of circumstances. The other case study that we feature in the report is the DeBerry Swan School in Springfield. And I think this is the one that should cause us to think the most about our policies and how we do better as a Commonwealth going forward, because this was a very significant investment in a neighborhood of Springfield that had been redlined and had seen, as a result of that, very extreme levels of disinvestment. 15% of the homes around the school are vacant. Almost 60% of the children in this neighborhood live below the poverty level. Over 90% of the students that attend this school are low income. And it's, even with a new building, it's only performing at the 3rd or 4th percentile in the state's accountability ratings. So it's all well and good that these students have an excellent building to attend, but they're not living in a neighborhood of opportunity, they're not thriving. And there are certainly ways that we can be more creative to coordinate our investments, to build true community schools, to ensure that the school has the space to be a central anchor in that neighborhood supporting families, and that it is drawing investment into the neighborhood in a way that creates a true mixed income neighborhood and a true mixed income school, because there are tons of assets in this neighborhood when you look at open space, when you look at Springfield College, in American International College right on its border, Springfield Technical Community College is down the street, Mass Mutual, one of the largest employers in the state, is less than a mile down the road. So there is huge opportunity to build something special here. And I think if the state has a policy that's structured to support that kind of investment, we will see it happen. So quickly, I'll take you through the recommendations that are within the report now. The first one is to increase MSBA funding and prioritize inadequate buildings. Clearly, the MSBA needs more money. We're only building about 17 schools a year in the entire Commonwealth, so we're not doing our generational part to just keep up with the inventory, whether you're talking about urban, suburban, or rural. Given the cost increases, we need to increase our investment. But I think it's also, as Anthony has shown, pretty clear that to the extent that we have dollars, we're not using them to meet the highest needs first and foremost. So we've got to make sure that we expend our resources equitably. And that begins with reimbursement rate policies that recognize that it costs more to build in urban areas than it does elsewhere. The statute clearly says that, even though it says may, the authority may recognize that it costs more to build in urban areas. It actually does cost more to build in urban areas, so it's really important that the authorities' administrative and regulatory policies are consistent with that reality. The MSBA right now is conducting its next facilities assessment, so pretty soon we'll have new data on what the current state of buildings is in Massachusetts. And from that, we ought to have a list of buildings that are clearly unacceptable and not suitable to learning, and we should make it a priority to address those. I think our analysis shows that if we did that, we could take care of that list in relatively short order, because Massachusetts is fortunate. There are a lot of states that have much deeper problems. We have comparatively less work to do, but that doesn't mean we don't need to do it. In order to get this done, I think we sort of have some sort of requirement that when a building needs to be replaced, that the state and the communities are each doing their part. That's how Chapter 70 works when it comes to operating spending. We have a foundation budget, we calculate a community's financial ability pay, and then we make sure they pay up to their ability to pay and that the students get adequate resources for learning. There's no reason not to take the same general approach when it comes to facilities, given the impact they have on student learning outcomes. A couple more now. Reimbursing communities for the cost of co-located facilities. So if a city were to put a library, a public library within a school building, that would be a very efficient use of public resources, and that space would get utilized more fully all throughout the day, whether it's adults in the evening or children during the school day. Right now, we don't have a way to accommodate that smart investment. But it seems like whether it's a library or a recreation center or other shared community facilities, we should incentivize efficiency. It's particularly important, again, in neighborhoods like Mason Square, where the DeBerry Swan School is in Springfield, where we need to make sure that we're using all our resources to serve the community as well as we can. Helping urban districts build regional magnet schools to increase racial and economic integration is something that other states are doing. Most notably, Connecticut, right across the border, has had considerable success using magnet schools to create integrated schools. It's something we did in Massachusetts 2 decades ago. We stopped doing it, and our schools have become more segregated as a result. I think as we think about school building policies in the future, we need to come back to that. And the final recommendation is one that we didn't originally have in our drafts, and I think several reviewers pointed out that communities need assistance when it comes to feasibility studies for projects, looking at what it's going to actually cost to build a building so they can plan accordingly, developing master plans when you're trying to consolidate schools and replace 2 or 3 schools with a single new one. That's obviously a very challenging thing to do as a community, and state support to develop those master plans, particularly if you want to incentivize regionalization of schools with declining school population statewide. I think it'd be well worth state investment to support the development of those. And then lastly, long-term stewardship. The buildings that we are constructing today are very different than what has served students previously. They have way more technology and complicated systems that are challenging to operate and expensive to maintain. And I think we've got to be really thoughtful about how we're putting cities in the best position to steward those assets, which are both their own but significantly state assets as well. So that is all. I just want to personally thank Paul and Anthony for their support on this project. We spent a long time on this. I think more time than any other project I've worked on previously, maybe. And I think the reason why was because this is such an important issue, and Paul and Anthony approached this with the real dedication. I think Paul, as an urban parent, understands the challenge as well. But hopefully the good work that they all done will be useful to all of you. So I'll pass it back to Paul now to lead the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Ben and Anthony, for presenting a really comprehensive report pretty succinctly. And I urge all of you in the audience and watching online, download the report, read the report. But the great thing about today is we have the opportunity to hear about the report from several informed stakeholders and leaders in this topic. So, Ben, I want to thank you for the opportunity to work with you. And you can clearly tell how much of a passion this is of Ben's, and that's particularly commendable. I know from our perspective, it is vitally important as well. And I think it's important to the Commonwealth as a whole. If you look at our long and illustrious history leading education and school issues, it includes the founding of the first school in the country in 1635, the Boston Latin School. Fortunately, since then, school construction has evolved. It's also gotten a lot more expensive. So when we last evolved this state partnership with communities and school districts, it was over 20 years ago with the creation of MSBA. That was a huge step forward. It's made big inroads across the Commonwealth, but there needs to be a further evolution. In Worcester in particular, I know my own daughter attended the same high school I did. She graduated, and now 2 years later, students are attending a new high school. That's great. However, we have elementary schools, as Representative Consalvo mentioned, that predate World War II and some that are 100 years old. So it's clear that this is affecting disproportionately urban centers and, frankly, some of the state's most needy students. And it's critical that we invest in their future. I mean, as Ben Franklin said, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. So we look forward to working with all of you on this topic and hearing from our panel. So those of you who got the invitation know I am not Jennifer Herring. That's probably pretty obvious. She unfortunately is ill, so she's with the Worcester Education Collaborative and could not make it, but sends her best support for this project. I'm now proud to introduce our panel. Going in order, Andrew O'Leary, Superintendent for the New Bedford Public Schools, and then John Nunnery, Executive Director of the American Institute of Architects here in Massachusetts, Mayor Jared Nicholson, the City of Lynn, and Jessica Tang, the President of the American Federation of Teachers here in Massachusetts. So on that note, we're going to turn it over to the panelists and discuss some framing questions and then open it up to the audience for Q&A for a bit. But I really think the critical question to start with is really why this report is so pivotal and so important, and particularly talking about how access to modern schools is essential to a complete education. And that includes, to Ben's point, not amenities, but necessities like libraries and other facilities. So happy to turn over the panel and have you react accordingly.
Certainly. So Andrew O'Leary, Superintendent of New Bedford Public Schools and the parent of 5 who have or are or will be going through New Bedford High School, designed in 1969. And in terms of the specific question as to the adequacies, I think our high school, we do have schools of a World War I vintage in New Bedford. So while we did manage to close the last Spanish-American era school in 2016. So I'm a former social studies teacher, so that's how I frame things. But New Bedford High School, it's a 3,000 student school, and what does education look like in the 21st century? We can certainly focus on high technology and modern vocations and things like that, but what we also see are inclusive environments where students with needs, medically fragile needs, developmental needs, are all served in inclusive environments. And if you consider a school that was designed and based on the architectural criteria in 1969, that predates a lot of the reforms that are supposed to guide inclusive environments for students who have those complex needs. So that alone kind of describes what we're facing. And when we do invest those funds, the Student Opportunity Act funds, which are very welcome, and we invest those funds in building inclusive environments, hiring co-teachers, hiring additional health aides and staff and others, there is inherent inefficiencies within those spaces. And so the high school is a good example, and how a city like New Bedford, with its debt capacity, et cetera, and its ability or lack thereof to long-term plan, how it can build and execute a large high school to meet those needs. You're talking ultimately generations, or planning generations ahead, and under the current structure, that's not possible. So that's the high school, and I think that's a great example of what you're asking.
I would just add, Jared Nicholson, Mayor of Lynn. I'm also a Lynn Public School parent. As of a couple weeks ago, my son started kindergarten. So it's been going great for him, although he is in a facility that was built in 1911. We do have a Spanish-American vintage Aborn Elementary School, was built in 1898, which I think is, I don't know exactly when the Spanish-American War was, but it's somewhere around there. And not only do these schools not have the parts of a school that we now expect, in Lynn especially, the facilities are outdated, but the buildings are also overcrowded. So we've had a huge increase in students over the years, I think 20% in the last 20 years or so, and we have been grateful beneficiaries of the Student Opportunity Act and the annual operating budget. So we could hire more teachers, but we don't have the classrooms to put them in. And we've been desperately trying to fix that, adding modulars, being creative, reusing existing buildings. We bought a bank headquarters and turned it into a school. So we've been finding a way, but that's all been done outside of the MSBA system, which is incredibly helpful, and they have an amazing team that do amazing work, but we're clearly short of where we need to be and want to be on our facilities.
I'll share my perspective as a teacher that this report is actually very validating in that you know, as many of the educators in here, and I see, you know, Phil, who's president of Lynn over there, and Leah, who's executive vice president of the Boston Teachers Union, this is our lived experience, what's in this report. Like, the number of times we've been advocating for funding for our school buildings and saying, no, like, you don't understand, not all of our schools actually even have libraries. We don't necessarily have science labs. Mayor Nicholson and I were just talking about playgrounds, and he was telling me, because I had visited a school in Lynn, and I said, yeah, and they took down the playground structure. I was like, that's terrible. So the elementary school students don't have playgrounds. And he was like, oh, that's not the only one. I mean, these are the conditions that our students are learning in right now. And when you look at the data that's compiled here, it reflects the story that we have experienced, but also the experience that needs to change for our students moving forward. And so at the same time that we're looking at you know, the disproportionate impacts on students of color, and we're trying to correct for the institutionalized racism, I'm going to call it, that has resulted in these conditions, that they are still existing today in 2025 is a problem that needs to urgently be corrected. And so, but while I'm actually was really angry reading a lot of this and seeing that data, because again, we've experienced it, and just this morning, I was also talking to Leia, and she was like, yeah, we just got another report of mold in school buildings. And I'm just like unfazed because we've gotten used to hearing that, right? And we shouldn't normalize that. That's not normal. That's not okay. The number of teachers who have gotten the septum nose surgery and have come back and said, yeah, and actually that's very common for apparently teachers who work in these urban schools in these very old buildings. It impacts the physical health of our students too, the students who have asthma, the students who have severe medical needs, et cetera. There is an impact, of course, on your learning conditions, your physical learning conditions, and your ability to learn. And I could say so much more about that. But I do want to say something hopeful, though, right? The first step of solving a problem is identifying, acknowledging the problem, right? And we've also seen the successes. So I've had an opportunity to visit the Quincy Upper School that was mentioned earlier and Boston Arts Academy. And they are beautiful, wonderful new buildings. So the opportunity that the MSBA holds is right before us. And what we're asking for right now, though, is just that it be distributed more equitably, and so that it can be part of the solution of also addressing the gaps that we've already identified for so long.
I'm John Nunnery, Executive Director of American Institute of Architects. My perspective is a little different in the sense of we're the guys that you hire to design the schools. And what I find interesting about the MassInc survey is that it helps reinforce other surveys that have been out there that have essentially drawn the same conclusion. There was a survey done by the state that was released in March, the Green and Healthy Schools report, that while that report focused a little more on indoor air quality and issues related to the interior environment of a school, and that report itself initiated during COVID, so as you can imagine, that's why there's that particular focus. There's been other studies. The General Accounting Office has done studies, the Environmental Protection Agency has done studies, and they've all proved the same thing, which is exactly what the MassInc report has proved, which is that the environments of schools, the indoor environments of schools, have an effect on the way our children learn. It's not something that we from the architectural profession take as a peripheral issue. It's something that's core to the way we think about designing buildings. And picking up on something Jessica just said, the identify and acknowledge the problem, I think this report is helping to do exactly that. I think it's identifying that there is clearly a need, that when MSBA reformed itself back in 2000 and reopened its doors in 2004, it had the best ideals and intentions to try to take a program that prior to that was driven a little more by politics, I would say, than equity. And the program was revamped with an eye towards equity. And now 21 years later, we have this opportunity to look at the program again and see, or to not necessarily say, let's throw it out, but to say this is a program that is working, how can we make it better? And along those lines, that's why we're here in the legislature. There's clearly bills that are pending that are looking to do exactly that. And I know Senator Crichton will probably talk about that a little later because he's part of that conversation.
I want to thank you all for providing such critical windows, and no pun intended, into safe schools and the facility needs that are very real. I myself grew up in an elementary school in Worcester that has not been renovated, and Ben's point on an all-purpose room is how I grew up, eating lunch at my desk, playing gym in the same room that we collected microwave lunches in. Could we talk a bit about how school building policy and future investments in facilities can be structured to directly confront the inequities the report illustrates?
Yes, certainly, and I know we've talked about this as well, but I do think there's an initial step we take that closes off some opportunities. So because of MSBA's successful track record, and because it's such a successful institution that is executing these projects so well, and we have experience of that in New Bedford. I think we look past other opportunities to invest in our buildings. There are significant measures of debt undertaken by mass development. There are charter school funds, skills capital funds, straight municipal investment, legislative set-asides. So I think we should start from first principles in that we do have, the MSBA survey will reveal, as Ben outlined, that we have these conditions where there are large numbers of students in level 4 or whatever the new metric will be, and what is the best package that we can come up with, the best debt finance package. I find it curious, debt is often seen as a bad thing, but all of us engage in debt for our mortgages and our cars and our education, and certainly there's no better investment than schools in those cities with growing population, growing numbers of Hispanic, Latino, and immigrant students who are, you'll see in the Mass Taxpayer Foundation report, contributing an outsized impact to our economy now and in the future as well. So there's plenty of room for optimism. There's plenty of room to start from first principles as to how we can move the largest percentage of a growing population of students into optimum learning environments. I think there's a great opportunity for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really key insight from the report is that we really have the means to fix this if we want to, and that the amount of money that is and can be going into school construction, if it was prioritized differently and more consistently, really with, I think, the original purpose of the whole effort, that we could get out of this hole. And you see the disparities in the reimbursement rate, and that's real, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's the difference between treating everybody the same, so on paper all the policies apply to the districts in the same way in terms of what's reimbursable and what's not, and making sure people have what they need to accomplish the goals of the program. So the difference between equality and treating all the difference the same, and equity and making sure that districts are actually able to build these schools. And for Lynn, we have a big middle school underway right now, which we're so excited about and so grateful to the MSBA's support. That building should hopefully be open in a couple of years. It's almost $200 million school. The reimbursement rate as of about 2 years ago was projected to be around 45% or so. So 35 percentage points less than what it should be, because the construction rates were being reimbursed so far below market and so much of the cost was non-reimbursable. The legislature and the MSBA heard a lot of advocacy from us and other gateway cities or similarly situated communities, and made some great changes and investments that have increased that reimbursement for that project 20 percentage points to the mid-60s. That's a $30 million swing. So that was the difference between us being able to do that project and us having to essentially walk away. But it's still a 15 percentage point gap from where the statute sort of sets out for us to be at 80%. And so I think trying to look at that chart and see how we can get closer to the goal of giving communities what it is that they need to be able to build the buildings that are going to get us to the point where every student has access to a high quality facility is something this report is hopefully going to push us to do.
Yeah, I want to also reiterate the importance of re-examining the reimbursement policies, especially also when we're thinking about urban locations and the realities that urban construction has, and the likelihood that there would be environmental mediations that need to be considered as well. And then the other thing I'll mention as well is also, I think that sometimes there's two things actually. One is, again, when you're an underfunded school district, or an underfunded area, you may not have the capacity to do the planning process that then gets you to the point where you can ask for the funds from the MSBA in the first place, right? So I do think that's really important in terms of thinking about how do we make the process more equitable. And then also, it tends to be the districts that are underfunded that also don't have potentially the amount of money that's needed to then be able to meet the qualifications to get the funding as well, right? And so that, I think, is also probably contributing to the inequities that we're seeing. And that reminds me too of then, I think, how do we also then pair it with federal reimbursement opportunities as we're trying to green our schools as well. And unfortunately, the big ugly bill, I refuse to call it beautiful because I don't think it's beautiful at all, decimated a lot of the opportunities there for federal funding to be investing and fixing up and greening our schools too. But there is one that made it through, which was the heat pumps and HVAC funding. And so how then, is there an opportunity also for the MSBA or the state to provide bridge funding? Because again, it's oftentimes our poorer districts or underfunded districts that don't have the bridge funding to then actually get the grants to be able to then institute the heat pumps, et cetera, and then get the reimbursement, right? And so that's maybe something else to think about as we're looking at this bigger picture of equity and how do we make the available reimbursements or supports and funds more equitably available.
I think what everybody has mentioned so far are identifying some of the potential solutions to what have been identified as some of the potential problems. And I agree with all of them. And we'll go back to something I said earlier, which is how do we move the needle forward on that? And I think the best thing that we can do is a piece of legislation that's been moving through the legislature. It started in the Senate again in 2021, moved through the Senate in the 23-24 session. It was engrossed by the Senate and currently is now with the Joint Committee on Rules. And it's Senate Bill 403 by Senator Lewis, which has been amended by a variety of other senators. But essentially, it's creating a commission to take all of these ideas that we have and say, let's talk about them. Let's actually do something. Some of the ideas, should we take the 1% or the 1 penny on the sales tax and make it 2 to find some of these dollars? Should we take some of the Chapter 70 funding and be able to use that for capital construction? There are a variety of ideas that are out there that can work, that are going to help resolve some of the inequity issues that we're seeing, but we need the legislature, unfortunately, to help do exactly what you've mentioned, Mayor, which is prioritize differently. To a certain extent, MSBA is bound by the rules that were written in 2000, and it's 21 years later, and while those rules were written with the greatest of intention back in 2000, it is 21 years later. The world has changed. Construction costs have risen. And I think it is the prime time for the legislature to say, let's look at the founding language of MSBA and see how we can tweak it to actually start addressing some of these problems. Tweak it meaning, again, find more funding if that's what's needed. Loosen up the constraints that MSBA may find itself in terms of trying to actually implement the program. I think that might be the best way to move forward.
Thank you. And as noted, the state has really led the way in a lot of respects, but it is, I think this report clearly illustrates, as do all your remarks, that the fact that there needs to be a full dialogue, and that includes everyone, the stakeholders in this audience, watching at home, the urban students, their families, the superintendents, communities, the treasurer, the governor, legislative leadership. This is a multifaceted discussion that we hope this report informs. And I really want to commend the mayor. Your point on equity versus equality is absolutely central to this report. And there is a very clear difference, and it's never been starker than looking at school facility needs in the Commonwealth. Several of you talked, I think, really compellingly. Mary, you mentioned the swing of 30 million. Jessica, you made some compelling points as well, but I think we should talk a bit about what can be done to ensure that the differences in community wealth and bonding, because our state cities are not only home to some of the most needy students, they're also home to some of the most pressed financial municipal governments. So how can we ensure that differences in wealth and bonding doesn't determine whether students learn in 19th century, 20th century, or 21st century facilities? And how do we empower those communities? What are some of the issues that could be brought to the forefront to help those communities take on the projects rather than be deterred?
Yeah, just real quickly, I do think, and I'm glad the report mentioned it, that communities should have skin in the game. I think there's great tools by the Division of Local Services. Anyone can go on and see the dashboards as to how much debt cities are taking on versus their general fund and all of that. I would say right here, it might be impolitic to say I think New Bedford as a municipality is not taking on enough debt for its projects. However, even were it to reach the state average or go above that, it wouldn't be even close to being able to accomplish a building. So certainly there are other mechanisms for taking on debt. I mentioned mass development. The state can sponsor debt on behalf of municipalities as well. So I do think there would be a greater appetite for cities to take on that debt, or there are other mechanisms to match that could ultimately achieve projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, and absolutely the community should be involved. I think the way the system works now, it's worth knowing how it interacts with Prop 2.5. So for the Pickering Middle School I was talking about, this is our second, as a community, this is our second run at doing that school. And we were close in 2016, but needed a vote of the voters to authorize the debt, to do a debt exclusion because of where we were with Prop 2.5. And that vote went down 2-1. And there were a lot of reasons for that, and specifics about the site, about things that are happening politically in the city. But I think a major one was that a working class community in Greater Boston, one of the most prosperous regions in the whole world, we're seeing our enrollment up, and which is not necessarily common for the region, and so people felt like they were being asked to shoulder a cost and were the least able to do so, and so they rejected it, and that is, we're going to continue to run into that. The Prop 2.5 debt limits and voter requirements, if something isn't changed about either the MSBA reimbursement rate and how much of that puts on the district, or what the requirements are for Prop 2.5. We also are in a paradigm on MSBA that sort of limits the option sets to new build and repair. And repair is wonderful. We take advantage of it all the time, and it helps keep the buildings safe and up to date. But it's really just tinkering around the edges in terms of our issues around capacity, but also about the programmatic features of the building. And we've been able to make, I think, great strides at the secondary level by going outside that framework. We borrowed to buy a 5-story, 150,000 square feet commercial building that we've converted into a school. We moved an educational program to an old adult daycare building that the city owned, and we increased capacity at our tech school by 15%. As a result, we took an old high school building that was being underutilized, and we're able to open a brand new STEAM academy because of the additional capacity we required. But all of those transactions were done without specific state support because they don't fit into that framework. So thinking about how to support those other kinds of outside the box moves as well could be an alternative.
I do think that we have to explore all the different stakeholders and what they, what the superintendent and mayor shared, can also be, how they can also be a part of the solution. But I also want to go back to that piece of equality versus equity, and how we can perhaps revisit the formula to make it more equitable. And one possible blueprint or example, I think, is the Student Opportunities Act and Chapter 70 funding formula that was recently changed. And again, I do actually think it's time, just as we're revisiting the MSBA, SOA did wonderful things, and it's also time to revisit that funding formula. However, I think that the concept of readjusting the formulas to be reflective of the disparate needs is one way to move forward. But again, if we're going to look at SOA and Chapter 70 funding and the changes there as a model of potentially how we can make it more equitable for the MSBA funding, we need to start with the commissions that actually are going to sit down and look through the data and do that deeper dive of what's working, what's not, what can we learn from SOA, and while we're also advocating for that to be looked at again, looking again at an MSBA commission to really take a deeper dive into that. It took a lot of work. It was a many years long process of coming up with a formula. And, again, we've seen incredible results, but it doesn't mean that it can't be improved and made better. And I think that's what we're trying to look at here as well.
Can I just piggyback on something on that? Because I think it's exactly right. And when we're thinking about these formulas, the 80% cap is completely arbitrary. It was just decided that was enough is enough, and 80% is going to be the max. But based on the actual formula and the way that they're determining the percentages, if you looked at a community's wealth, some communities would be even higher than the 80%. And that's something that the proposed legislation that you mentioned would fix. Also, there's history of the Commonwealth understanding that certain communities don't have an ability to shoulder a particular portion of a school construction. When the state authorized Boston University to take over Chelsea Public Schools, they reimbursed the new construction of new Chelsea facilities at a rate of 95%. Even higher, I think, 98%. So there's nothing that is sort of preordained about the fact that 80% has to be the max. We're also not even hitting 80% on any of these projects. So even just getting us to 80%, I think would be a big improvement.
As a non-finance guy, as an architect, I agree with what you've said. If we're going to look at ways in which to try to get municipalities to be able to fund their share, I think we have to acknowledge, as the mayor said, even our best efforts, even if we did everything right, there will still be municipalities that just are not going to be able to afford it. But that being said, there are simple things that could be done, at least from the architect's perspective, like having a conversation about eligible costs. What is reimbursable versus what is not? And is it fair that in urban settings where land is generally much more expensive, all of a sudden you're not being reimbursed for any of those costs? So the reimbursement formula, I would also argue that I said I wouldn't mention this, but I will mention it because it does, I think, make sense. One of the things that you could look at is when in the process a city or town or a municipality actually goes to the town vote, which generally occurs right at the end of schematic design. And when you're doing a set of drawings and specifications for a brand new school, which is often a 5 to 6 year project, you're being forced within the first year or so to say, well, this is the building, this is the cost, we're going to go to town meeting and do a debt exclusion for that. Knowing full well that after you get through schematic design, you're going to get into design development where the architect and their consulting team are really sharpening their pencil to say, well, is this the best mechanical system to use? Or, is this really the best site to use? And what you will end up finding through design development is cost savings. And so there could be an argument that could be made that, for instance, says, well, maybe MSBA moves out the awarding of your statement of interest to the end of design development where construction costs and overall project costs are going to be a little lower because you've had more time to sharpen your pencil. So it's little moves that I think that could be made that will help go a long way, in addition to things like just putting more money into the system and acknowledging that the amount of money that was in the system in 2000 really isn't adequate in 2025.
So a couple reference points have been made already that I did want to speak to before we shift to the last question and then go to audience Q&A. A couple key points here are, one, this report does not call for, and none of the panelists are calling for, a literal blank check from the Commonwealth and MSBA. There is very clearly a role for municipal finance in this. There is simply a need to acknowledge that our state cities have some of the most disadvantaged students, some of the oldest and neediest schools, and there needs to be recognition of that in how the program prioritizes. But no one here is saying that it should be fully funded by the state and that the state cities should be the only ones receiving school funding. So I do want to address that. I also want to point out, I want to thank Jessica for bringing out the Student Opportunity Act, which is a really intriguing case study and model that has benefited the state cities and our most disadvantaged students. I do want to point out, though, for those of you who are not engaged in municipal government, who are not used to this exercise, there is a fundamental difference between operating funding and capital funding. So the Student Opportunity Act has been critical at restoring some equity to the operating funding. This report in this conversation demonstrates there needs to be a parallel conversation addressing the capital needs. And that's how government works. There's operating expenses and operating investments and capital investments. So I know that the Student Opportunity Act is not universally popular with some legislators. I do want to point out that did not address these capital needs. And to turn to that thought, how can we guide the conversation moving forward? What are some key principles in how could a more equitable future be framed around some of these opportunities? Are there key issues that we want policymakers to be thinking about? And given your multitude of perspectives, I'm hoping you can lay some foundations, no pun intended.
So I'm glad the report builds on some of the other work of Mass Inc. in terms of the segregated environments that we have in Massachusetts across districts. But this is dynamic. Tomorrow we have schools that are opening, or today, and Friday I'll be co-teaching a history class in the lower level with no windows at New Bedford High School. And so this is ongoing, and what the structure we have right now, far from creating magnet schools that are desegregating in and around our cities, the incentives right now are supporting, financing, subsidizing predominantly white segregated environments, as opposed to incentivizing a desegregation effort, which we could and should move to, given the dynamics of our state and the investments we should be making in our students. I would also say, thinking about the Student Opportunity Act and what you described, we're talking about efficiencies. So while we have to do it, it's inefficient for us to apply USDA funding to renovate the kitchen and cafeteria and windows at the lower level of New Bedford High School. If you go to New Bedford High School, you'll see what I'm talking about. You have beautiful, new, modern windows painted Whaler red in the lower level, and we can't touch the windows above that because those are cafeterias. USDA allows that reinvestment. Then when we're building counselor spaces, we go out to bid for $150,000. A modern counselor space has to have privacy and all of those things. So we hire more counselors with the Student Opportunity Act, but now we've got to build appropriate spaces by contract, and it's also what students deserve. The nurses' space at New Bedford High School, which sees significant and meets a significant amount of student needs, it's about 500 square feet. At the vocational school, which is down the street, which does not meet those needs, it's about 3,000 square feet. So we have to invest and maintain these spaces. We don't have a choice given our commitment, given our students' needs. So there are automatically inefficiencies going on. So reform can move us to a more efficient environment, and reform can serve our ultimate goal of having more integrated environments throughout the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think that framing about how to think about this as a need for reform on the capital side relative to the operating side is exactly right, that we did the Student Opportunity Act, and while there's certainly room for improvement and that should be looked into, we haven't done that on the capital side, and there's a huge gap. And, you know, I think about some of the original underpinnings of this system, where you have Chapter 70 that funds the budget every year and a local contribution, and some of the background of that, you had the McDuffie case, where the plaintiffs are saying that the Commonwealth is not living up to its constitutional obligations to educate students. And that case was obviously successful. The litigation or threat of litigation has been successful over the years to continue to push the state to fulfill those obligations. Massachusetts is not unique to have had that kind of litigation in trying to enforce rights to education that's enshrined in state constitutions. For example, in New Jersey, the Abbott decision took a set of urban districts and has very similar litigation. But in New Jersey, those cases and the subsequent litigation to enforce and discussion around it was both capital and operating. And so still today, in the last couple of years, you had this debate in New Jersey about is the state living up to its obligation to provide educational facilities that are consistent with the Abbott jurisprudence and their own constitutional right to an education under the New Jersey Constitution? And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves here in Massachusetts.
So one thing I've been thinking about is is the recent vision of a graduate that has come out. So I serve on the governor's grad council, where we're thinking about, not just grad requirements, but also what is it that we want every high school student to be able to learn, know, experience, et cetera, before they graduate. And that really comes down to a question of also then, what is it we believe all students deserve? But we really can't have that conversation without also talking about the physical facilities that enable that vision of a graduate to actually be a reality. And so I think that's something we need to be thinking about as well, is that while we're looking at the vision of a graduate, we have to look at, well, what are the necessary facilities to ensure that all students have those educational experiences and opportunities? Because the reality is, we do have schools that don't have 21st century science labs or science labs at all. We have schools that don't have the arts and music opportunities, or if we want to have more experiential learning, or ideally something that we believe all students deserve is community schools. In Boston, we call them hub schools. But again, the facilities go hand in hand with our ability to execute this vision of what all students deserve. And so thinking about that, what concerns me sometimes is the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, or we have these one-off projects. And so what is the longer-term plan to ensure that, because even the new schools today, 10, 20, 30 years, 50 years from now, are going to need some maintenance, right? And what we know in Boston is that it was decades of deferred maintenance that resulted in the really poor conditions that we see now today in so many of our schools. And if we are not also planning not just for the short term, but the longer term of how we're going to continue this cycle, then we have this vicious cycle where, families don't want to choose a school because it's not a nice facility. And then, if we have lower enrollment, then you have less investment, and then you have this vicious cycle, then less staff, and then you're at the point where, like, half the year you might get art or music or even science or social studies, which the social studies is what I taught, right? And this is a vicious cycle. And what we need to see is a positive cycle where we constantly are having new rebuilds and long-term facilities capital investment plan, where we also know that there will be opportunities for renovation and keeping up with all of the maintenance as well. And that ultimately then will create that more equitable landscape of schools throughout the Commonwealth that all of our students deserve, despite their zip code.
I'm glad you all said what I've been, my members have been saying for years, in the sense of we will be hired by a municipality to come in for a new school, again, a 5 to 7 year relationship. And we will put together a consultant team of 20 or 30 people with all sorts of letters after their names, and we'll design a $200 million new school. And towards the end of the project, we will turn it over oftentimes to the lead custodian. And I say that because oftentimes most of the cities and towns don't have a facilities planner, somebody who could actually look at all of the school buildings, or maybe even the entire municipality's set of buildings, to set up a maintenance plan. You all live in homes, some of you probably own your homes, and you're fully aware that when you don't invest in your home, things happen. And school buildings are no different. So to get to that 50-year building, in order for it to be a 50-year building, you know for a fact, or at least the design profession knows for a fact, that you're going to have to invest in that building over the years. And that calls into question when the state is going to have this conversation about what its needs are and how they are to be met. I think one of the questions has to be long-term facility planning. If the state is going to give a municipality 80%, let's assume they actually someday get to 80% or even higher, should there be, for instance, an obligation on the state's part to help the city and town maintain that building? The problem that you find, or that we have found, is that a lot of times you'll go to a city or town that has an old building stock. We are Massachusetts. We have some of the oldest building stock in the country. And the stock of building oftentimes is either past its useful life because it's 150 years old, or it's past its useful life because it was never maintained. Oftentimes it's usually because it wasn't maintained. And so to avoid this vicious cycle that we get into of spending a lot of money on a brand new building that in 30 years is now obsolete because it wasn't maintained, we should have that conversation. And again, I think we've talked about on the panel, various ways to get that conversation to move forward. But I do think that's an important part of the conversation is how do we maintain our buildings after they've been built?
I want to thank our panelists. I do want to open it up to all of you in the audience, not you watching online, but all of you physically here. If there are any questions, happy to forgive my finger. If you can ask your question, I'll repeat it for the benefit of those watching online later in our panelists. Yes. I will attempt to paraphrase your question for the panel and those watching later. I do want to note for those of you here, I did not know this gentleman was from Worcester, so that was not a that was not a preloaded question. He asked about the fact that communities can proceed with essentially one project at a time, and how that has consequences for communities spending what can be a significant amount of money to keep buildings that need full reconstruction. Use the proverbial Band-Aids to keep them running long enough to work their way down the queue. And that presents short and long-term consequences. So I'll turn it over to the panel.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity cost that we've seen, but we don't want to defer maintenance, as President Tang has said. You don't want to get into that game that we did over the past 20 years. It's a bigger bill in the end. And maybe John can confirm, but MSBA takes projects one at a time. As opposed to the SBA, which allowed districts to submit a package. The MSBA does a much better job than its predecessor, but it does take projects one at a time, and then essentially treats all cities and towns in Massachusetts equally, which on its face sounds appropriate, but as we've seen in terms of need, that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think it's another example of how the system sort of unintentionally creates a challenge for the larger urban districts, because if you're a smaller district, one at a time is not as big a deal, but if you have 40 schools, or in our case, we have almost 30 schools, it is more of a challenge. It obviously needs to be addressed in conjunction with the financing, because under the current system, we couldn't afford to do multiple schools at a time anyway, but were we to do that, that would be an issue, and absolutely on the thinking about the long-term value of these investments. There's a better way to get more value for the taxpayer dollar by being more proactive. And I think it's also important to note that these systems interact, the operating and the capital. So there's a determination on the operating side of how much is too much in terms of regular maintenance that we can use Chapter 70 funds for, and then how much would be considered capital in their eyes. That number is fixed and hasn't changed in 10, 15 years, despite the huge changes in construction costs and materials costs. So that should be revisited as well.
I don't have much more to add, except that I agree. Like in Boston, 112 schools, if we're doing one school a year, we will never complete renovating or improving all of our schools. And it's got to be a multi-year, multi-school plan moving forward. And again, that's part of the problem, what got us here in the first place.
I agree with everything that said. The old SBA was a process where you'd submit drawings in June, then municipal officials would come here to this building and make arguments for their particular project to be higher up on a list of like 200 projects, knowing that usually only the first 20 projects would get funded. As a result of that, the legislature said, let's rethink this, and created SBA as we understand it today, which is in theory more of a washing machine, where all projects get submitted and it doesn't favor one town or over another. But that doesn't solve the problem that's being brought up. I will note there are other states that have had this same problem and have tried to address it in different ways. Florida did it many years ago, where certain school districts would have 10 or 12 projects, and what they would do is they would bid them all at once. So you would get one massive contract. Now, admittedly, it's a massive contract, but the benefit of that was the bulk of scale. So when you're building 12 high schools, you're buying all your sheetrock all at once, and you're getting a much cheaper price on it, as with all your materials. That may or may not be applicable here, but the point is we have other examples that we could look at. I sat through a legislative hearing where the folks from Boston made the exact point that the mayor and President Tang made about the city of Boston. And I don't think that it is unreasonable to assume that we could, through a legislative commission or some other vehicle, put this conversation on the table and actually come up with a reasonable solution to address the inequity of gateway cities who are seeing where there is increases in student population. That's where we're seeing it, is in the gateway cities. We're seeing the decline in student population in the suburbs and in the rural. So there is an argument that says this is a real problem and that the cities or the gateway cities have a real need and that there should be a way to resolve that.
Thanks very much. Sir?
addressing deferred maintenance, those kinds of things that could instead local dollars be used for operations, and whether or not this injection of funds by the state perhaps would actually have a double benefit. One, creating these buildings that provide better opportunities for teaching and learning, but also freeing up local dollars to invest even more in what happens in the classroom.
Thank you. So to paraphrase from my research colleagues from the Worcester Regional Research Bureau and Mass Inc., given the fact there's deferred maintenance that cities are undertaking because of these outdated facilities, is it deducting from operational funding, and is there a essentially double factor of inequity?
Yeah, we didn't have that data to analyze that. We heard about it so frequently throughout the process that it makes us want to get that data. And I do think, I think Superintendent O'Leary can speak to this. I remember him walking me through some schools in New Bedford a few years ago and talking about what a savior SOA was in terms of improving the quality of those schools. But on the other hand, I'm sure he'd much prefer to be spending those dollars on instruction.
Yeah, I think so. Massachusetts financial reporting for schools is very sophisticated, but it can be reviewed online. So you can see the per pupil spending based down in those accounting categories, the function codes, et cetera. And what you do see is pre-SOA, districts like New Bedford were spending paltry amounts on facilities maintenance. And the logic of Chapter 70 is the money needs to go into the classroom, so there are caps, as the mayor said, on what you can spend. But we have doubled that with SOA, but that's doubling from 800 to 1,600. 1,600 is about the average in Massachusetts, or it was around 2020 when we started spending that money. So even then, schools that are funded above net school spending or well above net school spending are still spending more on preventive maintenance or enhancements under that accounting category. Then came the ESSER funding, and the ESSER funding did allow us to invest significantly. Our strategy was to invest in non-recurring costs. We invested in facilities. That became a little controversial when Secretary McMahon did the clawback in March that was ultimately overturned by the court. But those have been game changers for us. So the SOA and the ESSER funding have been game changers for us. But there is still that gap. So it's not apparent that, I guess, proportionately more. So proportionally more, we are spending more. But overall, you still do see well-financed districts spending more on that preventative maintenance as well.
Thank you. And ma'am, your hand was up through the whole answer, so I'm happy to have you be our next and I believe last question. Thank you, ma'am. And again, to paraphrase for those watching later, the question was about vocational and technical education and the needs of those schools. I want to add a personal note. My son graduated from Worcester Technical High School, so believe me, ma'am, I'm a big believer. I'm going to first turn to my colleagues who performed the report.
Yeah, so I'll quickly just go back to this slide from a presentation. We did look at career, vocational, and technical schools. We didn't analyze the disparities by building quality in the same way, but we did look at how many projects that they received proportional to their existence across Massachusetts, and we found that they were disproportionately favored. That being said, as of the 2016 data, there were about 30 vocational technical schools, and they received 12 invitations, and there were 156 invitations extended from 2015 to 2024. So they fared pretty well, but this is a pretty small sample size. So doing disproportionately well here compared to suburban districts, which are hundreds of districts across the Commonwealth, it's an issue of scale. But yeah, we are interested in understanding those disparities as well and the needs of vocational schools, because that's a growing focus across the Commonwealth and making sure that those students are prepared to enter the workforce. So your point's well taken.
And I would just also add to that, we surveyed Gateway City leaders, and one of the most common responses on the survey was more resources to add CVTE spaces to comprehensive high schools. I think a lot of systems took those spaces out in past years when there were budget cuts, where there was a focus on college over career. And I think today our thinking is much more integrated college and career education at the secondary level, and they want to see those opportunities for that kind of learning come back.
In 2 points I want to make before I see if the panelists have a response. One is, in Worcester, each of the public high schools that have been built has so-called Chapter 74 vocational elements to them, so they each have a different focus determined by our school committee based on market need, forecasting long-term vocational needs, given the popularity of our technical high school, which was first built about 20 years ago and is still state-of-the-art. Secondly, I only know this as an avid reader of the news media. I'm not in any way in the know, but clearly Mayor Wu and the City of Boston are pushing forward with Madison Park, which is a very substantive commitment to vocational education, and from what I read in the Globe, could be the most expensive project thus far. That being said, I'm happy to see if any of my colleagues on the panel have any reactions.
Yeah, I mean, we have our own in-district vocational technical school in Lynn, and this has been a huge priority. There's clearly tons of demand, like a lot of districts. We have a wait list, and we've been trying to chip away at that by adding capacity. We've added 15% to our Voc Tech school by creatively reusing different buildings. And I know it's a priority for the Healy Driscoll administration, too. I think there's a request for proposals coming for creative ways to add Voc Tech capacity, either in existing schools or the comprehensive universals, and we're certainly going to be pursuing that. So,
I'll just add too that I think we also have to look at, if we're looking at the racial inequity piece too, which CTEs and which students those CTEs that have benefited from SBA already are serving, and then hopefully also address then the places where that gap exists. So I really hope that Madison Park is going to be a new project, because that would actually significantly ameliorate, again, some of the racial inequity we've seen with the MSBA funding.
Thanks very much. And my next role is to invite up Senator Crichton as our closing commentator. And while he's approaching the podium, I'll note he represents the 3rd Essex District since 2018, which is the city of Lynn, represented on the panel by the mayor, the towns of Lynnfield, Marblehead, Nahant, Saugus, and Swampscott. He previously served on the Lynn City Council and is state representative. He's the chair of the Senate Committee on Juvenile and Emerging Adult Justice and the chair of the Joint Committee on Transportation. Most importantly to me, he's a fellow graduate of Colby College, which we were discussing before the program started. We both were government majors. He clearly is far more successful than I and obviously paid greater attention in class. So thank you, Senator.
Oh, there we go. Now, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, actually, still. It's an honor to be here. First, I just want to say thanks to Ben and to Paul and to Mass Inc. Policy Center, the Worcester Regional Research Bureau, also our friends from the Gateway Cities Caucus that have been coming in and out here. Really appreciate you organizing this. To all of you in attendance today and those streaming at home, thank you so much for paying attention. This is such a crucial issue. To our panelists, thank you for your insight. And to all of the teachers, educators, superintendents, school committee members, administration out there, I'm a proud product of the Lynn Public School System, K through 12, and I absolutely would not be sitting here today having an opportunity to speak on this if it wasn't for so many that helped me throughout my educational journey as well. And when I think back to that experience in Lynn, most of the school, I mean, almost all the schools that were functioning then are still functioning now, and very few new facilities there. And when I was in high school, we had a new high school being built. So the first few years I was at what we call the Old Classical. We were building a new school because our school was overcrowded. We were going into an abutting elementary school for classes, which obviously you don't want high school students mixing in with first graders, but we had to do that. Obviously significant infrastructure issues in this 100-year-old school. But as we built that new one, it became clear we needed to keep the old one going. And today, thanks to the efforts of Mayor Nicholson and so many others, we've repurposed that school. Again, a school that was over 100 years old, no longer considered adequate, but because of the challenges we face in Lynn, we have to make use of what we have. And I'm sure the mayor mentioned this, we have over 12 schools in our district over 100 years old. And I was so pleased to read in the report and really highlighting the urgency of the issue. And if we continue to wait, just how much bigger those numbers are going to continue to be. I'm very proud of what we've worked on here in the legislature. When you think of our focus on education, free community college, tuition equity, we've tried to be helpful with some flexibility with the MSBA as well for projects that have costs that have gone overrun. And certainly our biggest achievement, the Student Opportunity Act, which we greatly benefit from. But as was pointed out by so many folks here today, we can have all the money towards operations, the best teachers in the world, the best supports there for our families. But if you're in a crumbling school building, with issues around air quality, overcrowding, among other things, no student is going to reach their full potential there. I'm sure folks in this room and listening have schools in their district. If you haven't, please come visit. Would love to have you come to the City of Lynn. What you would see is a great deal of hardworking, dedicated, committed teachers and educators, students striving with so many other challenges, families there to support them, everyone working as hard as you can be. But you're also going to see students in hallways because they're too crowded. You're going to see closets that are meant for janitorial uses being filled in as side office space to have a private conversation. You're going to see many, many challenges, and I think seeing is believing, so please visit your gateway city schools or your Boston schools or wherever you're from to recognize how crucial this issue is for us. And lastly, I'd just like to again, thank everyone for being here and recognizing that our attention is pulled in a million different directions these days, whether you're looking at the federal or state level or national, international level. This issue deserves to be treated with a great sense of urgency. In Massachusetts, as the report notes, as I'm sure was stated here today, every student has a constitutional right to an equal education. And right now, we are failing that. It's incumbent upon all of us to roll up our sleeves, and I appreciate the work that's been done to date, but to pass meaningful policies that will give each and every student, each and every family that right that we guarantee them. Thank you so much for everyone for attending here today, and we look forward to the hard work that comes ahead.
Thank you, Senator. And I would ask everyone, let's give all the various participants a big round of applause for all their contributions. And it's vitally important this conversation continues. This is the beginning, not the end of that conversation, and we look forward to working with each and every stakeholder to make significant changes moving forward. Thanks very much, everyone.